And now let me introduce our speaker for the day, Leo Panitch. It's an honor to be able to bring him to you. He is indisputably Canada's premier left thinker. He's widely known for his insightful writings, as well as his work with the Socialist Project, which is jointly sponsoring today's webinar, along with the Center for Global Justice. Leo is Distinguished Research Professor of Political Science and Canada Research Chair in Comparative Political Economy at York University. Since 1985, he has co-edited the Socialist Register, an annual survey of movements and ideas from the standpoint of the independent New Left. The Register has played a major role in developing Marxism's conceptual framework for advancing a democratic, cooperative, and egalitarian socialist alternative to capitalist competition, exploitation, and insecurity. Aside from the Herculean production of 35 annual volumes, a pretty impressive record, there stands his definitive The Making of Global Capitalism, co-authored with Sam Gindin. This is a comprehensive study of the growth of a global capitalist system, starting with the Roosevelt administration. They show how globalization was consciously planned and managed by the US, the world's most powerful state. The book is essential reading for us at the Center for Global Justice. Leo has now just come out with a new volume, Searching for Socialism. I think it's just been published, so I haven't seen it yet, but I'm looking forward to it. Today, Leo will talk to us about capitalism, socialism, and the pandemic. Welcome, Leo. The floor is yours.
I'm very, very glad to be here, Cliff. I especially appreciate the invitation because, as you know, in the middle of February, I attended a panel discussion that you were part of, sponsored by the Center for Global Justice in the Biblioteca Pública in San Miguel de Allende, where you guys are located. And although I had known many, many fellow travelers, both Americans and Canadians who had been going to San Miguel every year in the winter months and telling me what a remarkable collection of lefties, intellectual and cultural, were to be found there, my wife and I went there for the first time in February. And who did I discover? I discovered you, who I had met through the Radical Philosophy Association in a trip that you sponsored for a bunch of us to go to Cuba. Liz Maestras, my dear friend from the Breath Forum and Marxist Institute in New York, Gregory Demont, and a whole host of others. And I realized that you are a continuation of the romance that the North American left, especially the American left, has had with the Mexican Revolution since the beginning, since the early part of the 20th century. Of course, that was most solidified in art with the links that were created between the muralists of the type that I have to say, the walls where I attended that lecture back in February were covered in the most remarkable political murals. I was in New York in early March, just before everything was shut down, and attended at MoMA, a remarkable exhibit on the link between the muralists and the American left in the 1920s and 1930s. Fascinating. So that's by a long way of an introduction of saying, I never would have imagined that I'd be giving a talk to the Center for Global Justice so soon, unless I came back to San Miguel. And now the pandemic has created a situation in which I can do this through this medium in cyberspace. Of course, when I went there in February, one was aware that there was a very dangerous virus that had global dimensions. But I think the left needs to own this. It wasn't only capitalist states that were blithely ignoring what did happen by March. It was also well-educated people like ourselves. I remember going to and coming back on the airplane from Toronto to Mexico City, and no one was thinking about the pandemic, even though by that point, there were already a number of cases in North America. So there we have it. The pandemic was on the march in February, and not only were capitalist governments ignoring it, we on the left, I think, were thinking ourselves invincible in the face of it. The title I chose for this talk, Capitalism, Socialism, and the Pandemic, was deliberately chosen so that it would apply as much to the pandemic of 1918, 1919, the Spanish flu pandemic at the end of World War I, as it could apply to today. A speech could have been given, I'm sure speeches were given, called Capitalism, Socialism, and the Pandemic in 1918, 1919. It was known as the Spanish flu, and somewhat similar today, that was a misnomer, just as Trump was trying to name the current coronavirus the Chinese virus. In fact, that virus was begun in Kansas in the United States on a pig farm, and it was American soldiers sent to World War I and turning the tide in terms of the outcome of World War I, who carried it to Europe. And then after the war, they brought it back. And that was crucial to the second wave. What's, I think, important about, and why I wanted the title of the talk to reflect both pandemics, was that we are hearing today, as when heard then from the left, the phrase commonly intoned, socialism or barbarism. This was a phrase that Rosa Luxemburg, in her Junius pamphlet in 1916 during World War I, had made very famous, although it was by no means new. As she said in discussing it, a generation earlier, Engels had used the phrase, saying, capitalist society stands at a crossroads, either a transition to socialism or a regression to barbarism. She cited Engels, but in fact it was Kautsky who in 1892 actually said that. Engels probably repeated it in a speech, a very chilling speech he made in 1896, predicting very astonishingly the slaughter of inter-imperial wars that were likely to come in the early 20th century. But the phrase became associated with Luxemburg. And it became associated, of course, with barbarism in the form it took, with the inter-imperial conflicts. After the globalization and the dynamism of capitalism in, the early 20th century, the great second industrial revolution, that war brought people to the attention that if you weren't able to get out of capitalism, there would be a regression to barbarism. And one's hearing that again today in the context of this pandemic, in the context of the inability of capitalist states to prepare for it, to contain it properly, by virtue of the way in which so much of the public healthcare industry in contemporary capitalism has been demeaned through austerity, and the way even in those countries which do have universal Medicare, increasingly have it in a way that is bound up with private capital accumulation and the firms that provide healthcare, even to the public sector. So the parallels in that respect are important, I think, to bear in mind, especially at a moment when you could say for the first time since the 1910s, the word socialism has some good odor in the American public discourse. And then there's some other uncanny parallels. That conjuncture was marked by the assertion of American isolationism in the wake of World War I. We all know that Woodrow Wilson's attempt to get the United States to sign on to the League of Nations was defeated in the American Senate. And mixed up with that isolationism, which if you go back and read some of the speeches sound a lot like Trump, was an anti-immigration sentiment, which led by 1924 to the closure of American borders, to the great migration that had taken place to the United States, not least from Europe, from the 1870s, one could even say, when it came to Germans and the Irish, from the 1840s and 1850s onwards. So there are parallels that are very interesting. And then there's another parallel, that great second industrial revolution, which produced, of course, great breakthroughs in medicine, in drugs, as well as the impact that public sanitation services, which were finally introduced in urban areas by the beginning of the 20th century, were having, was not able to prevent the Great Flu at the end of World War I. People had to face soberly and coldly the fact that capitalist development, dynamic capitalist development, did not mean that the way in which nature always bit back humankind for the way it came to dominate nature, which was through plagues very often, that this could happen in capitalist industrialized societies, and even with an industrialized medical system. And we're seeing that today in the wake of the fourth great industrial revolution, the technological revolution, the information digital revolution as well. So there are parallels in that respect that are worth, I think, thinking about. The isolationism in that conjuncture, which came from a United States which was just asserting its primacy in 20th century capitalism, was just beginning to prove in the first decades of the 20th century that the 20th century belonged to the United States. It was the American century. The isolationism was reflected in the United States not joining the League of Nations, in the closure to migration, but it was negated by the dynamism of American capitalism through the 1920s. The carve up of the old empires, the old European empires, was crucial to the American placement in the Middle East, along with the British, in terms of the extraction of oil for the fossil fuel industry, which was so important to industrialization. The United States was crucially involved in that moment, in the carve up of the modern day Middle East. Secondly, the multinational corporations jumped over that isolationist policy. General Motors and Ford were setting up car assembly plants, not only in Canada, but in Europe through the 1920s. What was not so much the case as the way in which Trump's isolationism is countered and negated today was the limited capacity of the American state to take any responsibility for managing an international capitalism. The Fed had only been created in 1912. The American dollar was already beginning to replace the pound sterling as the global currency. And indeed, the reparations put upon the Germans for losing the war, which involved paying reparations to France and the United Kingdom, was really a matter of paying the London and Paris, and having them, by virtue of their debts to the United States, having borrowed so heavily to prosecute the war in dollars, shoveling that money back to New York. And one of the reasons that the 1920s produced the type of instability was that the Americans played a role in the 1920s, which helped to bring the world back to the gold standard, didn't manage the financialization that led to, and when the Great Depression came out of that financial instability, the Federal Reserve didn't have a clue to how to contain it. In today's conjuncture, it is the Federal Reserve alone amongst the American state apparatuses which has proved its competence in the current pandemic and the economic crisis that it has produced. The Fed has acted as the world central bank. Not only is the American central bank in underwriting the American stock market, buying municipal debt for the first time in its history, buying junk bonds so the bond market wouldn't collapse, but much lending indeed to small businesses, financing the American state's asset purchases of the largest trucking company in the United States. Practically, even no one has ever noticed this. In the same way the Treasury did that during the 2008-9 crisis when they bought a portion of General Motors. But what the Fed above all has done, which it did not at all do in the early part of the century after, in the conjuncture of the previous pandemic, was act as the world central bank, pouring dollars around the world through swaps to other central banks so that their financial markets would not be bereft of dollars, which is the global currency, and their financial systems would seize up. They expanded the swap lines that were used in 2008, 2007, 2008, to 9 other countries, including Mexico. And by virtue of that, have put some $5 trillion into the global economic system that has kept the financial system going, the capitalist financial system going. It's been extremely active. And unlike 2007-8, when it was hiding what it was doing in this respect, thinking that not only Republicans, but even Democrats would attack the Fed for lending dollars abroad in the middle of the crisis, the Fed has been very open about doing this. So there's a major contrast between what the American state was at the time of the pandemic in that conjuncture after World War I, 100 years ago, and what it is today. I want to come back to what the American state is today and how demeaned it is, apart from its capacity to be a firefighter in the face of financial crises. But first, I want to draw another parallel, and that is to bring up the question of socialism, the other side of socialism and barbarism. Of course, the Russian Revolution shares a date with the flu epidemic, 1918. But even apart from the promise of the Russian Revolution, the hopes that it generated, etc., one needs to remember the flowering of socialist movements and discourse and media in the United States in the decade of 1910. Debs running for president in 1912, the Appeal to Reason being the largest socialist newspaper in the United States with 500,000 subscribers, socialist mayors being elected in tiny little cowboy towns across the American West, right? And it wasn't only a matter in that moment, in that conjuncture of the Russian Revolution. The utterly parliamentarist British Labour Party, which had not been admitted to the Second International because it had never accepted the thesis of class struggle being at the core of transformative social change. It had always been premised on, we will bring the ruling class and the working class together in harmony. Right? In 1918, even the British Labour Party adopted its famous Clause 4, committing itself to the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and their democratic administration. So that pandemic was a moment in which to say socialism or barbarism provided, it seemed, a real alternative to capitalism. Right? And we see today, despite the fact that we now can look back and see that not without the role of the American state, the promise of the American Revolution, the promise of the Mexican Revolution was undermined. Right? We can see that despite commitments on the part of social democracy to socialist goals and values, those parties became increasingly integrated within the framework of a global capitalism through the course of the 20th century. We see that despite all of that, despite the collapse of communism after its denouement in a stagnating Stalinism by the 1960s and 70s and 80s, despite the loss of any commitment to socialism on the part of social democratic parties, all of who embraced Clinton's third way and took the American Democratic Party under Clinton's neoliberalism as their model, we see a revival of socialist promise and socialist discourse of all places in the heart of the empire over the course of the last years. And I'm not just speaking of Sanders' candidacy. I'm not only speaking of Our Revolution, which is of course his campaign organization. Although I don't think one should denigrate the way in which Sanders uses revolution, identifying a ruling class, identifying how it undermines democracy, insisting on the universalization of social programs, and above all, describing himself as the organizer in chief, should he be president, the image of the socialist cadre as the organizer. Right? One shouldn't denigrate that use of revolution, it seems to me, however modest, if you like, Sanders' proposals in fact are in revolutionary terms. But beyond that, one sees a flowering of socialist media in, of all places, the heart of the empire, with Jacobin having 50,000 subscribers and 2 million hits to its website a month. Now, whatever one wants to make of opinion polls that show a majority of Americans under 35 more positively disposed to socialism than capitalism, since one wants to say to them, what do you mean by socialism? Nevertheless, this does seem to me to give a concreteness, a possibility to the phrase socialism and barbarism a century after Rosa Luxemburg resurrected the term from the 1890s, that it hasn't had for a very, very long time. Now, one has to say that socialism did not replace capitalism, not only because of repression, not only because of the encirclement of the Russian Revolution, the extent to which that was a key factor in introducing the dictatorship in the Soviet Union, not only in the repression of socialist movements, not least in the United States, through the course of the 20th century. It also had to do with the dynamism of capitalism, especially after the Great Depression, some of which could be already seen in the 1920s, interrupted by the second great crisis of capitalism, and then brought back to life through the stimulus of the war economy as well as the New Deal, and through the post-war period, a massification of capitalist commodification and finance and credit, as well as a expansion of capitalist production both in capacities, both in goods and services, which did have the effect of integrating working classes in the advanced capitalist world into the capitalist economy in a way that would have been unimaginable to even the most sober Marxist critics at the time of the 1918-1919 pandemic. You could still argue then that Marx's prediction that with capitalist development would come proletarian immiseration was being proved visibly. Through the course of the 20th century, you could only hold on to that notion by saying that immiseration was relative in the advanced capitalist countries, because there was no question that the mass of the working class, that its standard of living was indeed increased. In good part, of course, through its own efforts in organizing the labor movement, through its political pressures within liberal democracies, right? But accessing thereby the enormous riches of capitalist commodities, sometimes through the welfare payments they received, more often through the collective bargaining gains, which in the American case, moreover, in the post-war period, when the rest of the advanced capitalist world opted for socialized universal Medicare, which was seeded, by the way, in what was the realization of the public health consequences of the pandemic of 1919. In the American case, the labor movement was able to obviate the winning of that by securing a medical insurance through collective bargaining, privatizing, if you like, healthcare through its collective bargaining strength. The result of that being that the United States has been left without a public Medicare system, the irrationality of which is exposed more than ever in the face of this pandemic. But the limits of a labor movement, which recruits members by promising them health insurance, private health insurance, right, was seen in the fact that the labor unions were not supporting Sanders in his demand for universal Medicare, because it would reduce their capacity to hold on to members, right, or to get new ones. So I think one does have to recognize that the fact that socialism versus barbarism did not seem much of an option for much of the century after the 1919 pandemic did have to do with the dynamism and integrative capacity of advanced capitalism. And insofar as that wasn't the case in what used to be known as the third world, the developing world, it nevertheless was the case that for the most part, what they aspired to was getting out of the underdevelopment that prevented industrialization in their countries, and getting on the capitalist commodification treadmill that was denied them by the reproduction of imperialism and colonialism, even with decolonization after World War II. Okay, that's the parallel I wanted to make, and I hope people find it somewhat interesting. But where does it really leave us in terms of the prospects for socialism today? I am not at all depressed about this by virtue of Sanders' defeat. I don't think that the energy in any sense has been diminished by that in any substantive way. And I think indeed you see the continuing energy of it in the extent to which the Black Lives Matter protests, these remarkable, this wave of protests that have taken place during the course of this pandemic in the face of police brutalization of the Black population. The fact that these protests are so heavily integrated racially is, I think, unlike the protests of the 1960s, except in the early 60s around the Civil Rights Act. But the massive protests, riots from 1964-5 on in almost all cities in the United States were not integrated ones. These are, and I think it has much to do with the shift to the left that has taken place, embracing a conception of socialism once again in the United States. Moreover, for all of the talk of American decline, for all of the talk of the United States no longer being at the center of the capitalist universe, it is nevertheless fascinating that that outbreak of political protest in the United States over what has always been the Achilles heel of American democracy, that is racism and the caste system that balkanizes the American working class. America remains enough in the public eye that it kicks off demonstrations right around the world of this kind of political nature. I think it was already the case with the anti-globalization movements, if you want to start with Seattle in 1999, that the irrationality of a global capitalism was becoming more and more visible to more and more young people. At that time, the disappointments with social democratic parties, with the communist parties, gave a strong anarchist tinge to those protests, a strong anti-party tinge, a admiration for the Zapatistas in Mexico articulated in terms of changing the world without taking power. But it was discovered through the course of those protests, coming to a climax with Occupy in 2011, that you can protest forever. You can protest till hell freezes over and you won't change the world. And there was a remarkable turn in the wake of that, back to politics, of which the Sanders phenomenon was one element. Podemos, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, the Corbyn phenomenon in Britain were other exemplars of it. And the fact that you've had a mobilizing political campaign explicitly defining itself as democratic socialist, which has centered on the irrationality of capitalist states in terms of growing inequality, and growing lack of access to public health seems to me to bode extremely well for the continuing viability of this socialist discourse and this socialist energy that we've seen, despite the defeats of Corbyn and Syriza and Sanders. What reinforces this is that the economic crisis of 2008, followed by the politics of austerity, which was installed everywhere after the stimulus that capitalist states engaged in, both monetary and fiscal, in order to prevent it turning into another Great Depression. The bringing financial markets back to their health reinforced their power to discipline states to not spend money on social expenditure so that they could pay off their debts to the financial system. What has happened by virtue of that development is that the economic crisis morphed into a political crisis. And that is what Trump represents. He represents not a continuation of the economic crisis so much, but a turning of that economic crisis into a political crisis, in which the illegitimacy of capitalist globalization in people's eyes on the left and as well as on the right has been a central factor. Unlike those who championed globalization in the 1980s and 90s and said it was a matter of states no longer being able to control capital and therefore needing to get on board with transnational capital flows. In fact, states were never bypassed by capital. They made globalization. You don't get free trade agreements by multinational corporations signing them. States sign free trade agreements. It was the free trade agreement that was signed between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, NAFTA, that epitomized the free trade agreements that codified globalization around the world, opened up trade markets and capital flows to the extent that they did. So states remained very active in a globalized capitalism. They were authors of it, but they legitimated it to their populations in terms of it being in the national interest. And that was especially done in the United States. NAFTA was presented by Clinton, despite having indicated he wasn't keen on it during his election campaign, as in the American national interest. And what Trump picked up by 2016, and so did Sanders, was the continuous failure of the Democratic Party to be able to demonstrate to so many American workers, as was also obvious to so many Mexican workers, that this was hardly in the national interest, insofar as one looked to what that did for the working classes in those countries. So globalization, by virtue of this contradiction between the legitimation of a political system still being based on nation-state identifications and a economic system that is increasingly oriented transnationally, that contradiction produces the kind of political crisis that Trump represents. In his case, of course, it is combined with a right-wing populism that has barbaric connotations to it inbuilt. Whereas in the case of the socialist critics of globalization, who also point to its lack of legitimacy in terms of democracy at a national level, are offering the alternative to those barbaric elements. What I've always been most concerned about, and I'll come to an end with this, since Trump's election, would be that there would be a punch-up between a Black Lives Matter demonstration and a local police force, with perhaps a police station being burnt by virtue of the police use of arms against demonstrators. And that insofar as local police forces and bicycle gangs form the base of Trump's political movement, that this would become the opportunity for a closure of democratic political space in the United States. I feared, after what happened in Minneapolis, after the demonstrations and riots that it produced, and after Trump was calling for the military to intervene, that we were seeing that script being written out. And that barbarism was going to be visited upon us in this pandemic situation via a Trump equivalency of the Napoleon Bonaparte dictatorship that Marx wrote about in the 18th Brumaire, which also, after, by the way, took place after a failed impeachment. I still fear that Trump will attempt to postpone the election, which will probably have to go to the Supreme Court. And of course, he'll do so in the most brazen way, given that he's made light of the pandemic, insofar as it is continuing in the fall, in the most brazen way, as he always does. He will say, well, we can't possibly have an election in these circumstances, and try to get the Supreme Court, since it's unclear who constitutionally is responsible for American elections. Is it Congress? Is it state level, et cetera? And if the Supreme Court were to endorse that postponement, I think it would make the riots that have taken place in recent weeks look like a Tea Party, and I don't mean the Boston Tea Party. Were he to run in the election and lose and refuse to resign on the grounds that postal balloting is necessarily fraudulent, right, that would produce an even greater wave of riots. And the question at that point would be whether Trump would be able to call in martial law and the army would accede to keeping him in power. I think we've had a foretaste of that, and the response of the generals, including of all people, Mad Dog Mattis, who was his defense secretary, and his chief of staff, Kelly, as well as a number of generals, saying they weren't going to be pulled into this, shows that there's still some life left in American democracy, even on the side of the forces of repression, the apparatuses of repression in the United States. Were Biden to win, he obviously doesn't represent the socialist wing of socialism or barbarism. What he would represent, it seems to me, is an attempt to rebuild some of the capacity of the American state that was already whittled away very heavily in the neoliberal era under Clinton and Obama, as well as the Bushes, but under Trump has been carried to an extreme. It's ironic that the one state agency that has shown its capacity in this pandemic is the Federal Reserve, which has the greatest autonomy from the American state apparatus. Independent central banks, which the left used to attack so much because they couldn't be given orders by democratically elected governments to run monetary policy the way they'd want. Well, the saving grace has been, and of course, mostly for the financiers, but also for the masses who are dependent on capitalist credit in order to be able to feed themselves and put a roof over their heads. Right? We have been dependent on what the Federal Reserve has done to keep this bloody system going. And it showed remarkable capacity to do that, planning capacity to be ready for it. In the case of the health system, what you see is the astonishing lack of capacity in the American state. Of course, we know Trump has run down the capacity of the Treasury and of the State Department, et cetera. But to see in report after report, in the context of the news about the pandemic, the way in which the Center for Disease Control was defunded, the way in which one agency for another dealing with pandemics under the auspices of National Security Council, not let alone the Department of Health and Human Resources, have been confused and diminished under this presidency, only doubles the effect of neoliberalism, whereby so much of public health care, so much of pandemic preparation was set out to contracts to private firms. Whether that was masks, this was done under the Clinton, but especially under the Obama administration as well, whether it was masks or ventilators. Clinton had in fact put in a major order for ventilators to be met in the United States in 2011-12 from a Japanese firm and owned firm in California at $3,000 a ventilator. But that contract was never realized because that firm was taken over by a large medical instruments company. And they didn't want that firm competing with the ventilators they were producing at 20 times the price. So they broke the contract, didn't fulfill it. You see the irrationality of capitalism and the irrationality of the capitalist state in that one instance. But carried under the Trump administration to a level which is dumbfounding. The question will then be whether, given the pressure of this socialist enervation, which we've seen, especially in the heart of the empire in recent years, a Biden victory, while in no sense socialist, would be open to a rebuilding of state capacity to introduce reforms which would give confidence again, not only to socialists, but to working class people, which would include the type of reforms to labor legislation, which would provide the basis for a class remobilization, in fact, a new class formation in the United States, wherein the balkanization of the class in racial terms would begin to be overcome, as they have not been overcome under the framework of the old collective bargaining and labor relations legislation. Were that to be the case, then what Rosa argued, which is that there is no real opposition between reform and revolution. Reform is the means, revolution is the end, would come onto the agenda. And we'd have some hope after this pandemic is over for beginning to deal with the environmental crisis, which is, of course, what barbarism means today in terms of its challenge, much more than the threat of inter-imperial war, that we might be able to begin to address that once again. I'll stop with that.
To participate in the discussion, we have Gregory Diamant with us, and Betsy Bowman, and myself. We'll probably all have questions that we'll want to ask. I'd like to pose a question somewhat related to this question of production being shut down. Relating, the question basically comes off your book, Making of Global Capitalism. Since writing it, there's been, well, a couple of major transformations. For one, as you've referred to, the Trump administration has sought to weaken the state apparatus, as well as the multilateral institutions that support globalism, WTO, NATO, as well as existing trade agreements. But second, the pandemic has disrupted the global supply chains that tie economies together. Might you now have to add another chapter to your book titled maybe The Unmaking of Global Capitalism?
Yeah, well, that was always, of course, the implication of the book, although our message was that we would like the unmaking to be done by socialists rather than by a return to inter-imperial rivalry.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back to the last chapter, we say a lot of that will depend on the Chinese working class.
Yeah.
Our argument was that the main contradictions in capitalism, in global capitalism, lie within states rather than between states. And while people have constantly, on the left, been constantly trying to resurrect Lenin's theory of imperialism by finding a return to inter-imperial rivalry, one empire will replace another or even lead to war, we were arguing that that was less likely than globalization being interrupted by domestic class struggles. And I think we've been borne out in that respect, especially in the United States, more than in China, although they certainly exist there. I mean, our question was, would the Chinese working class become integrated into consumerist, credit-driven capitalism the way the American working class, or at least large portions of it were, right? But it looks like we underestimated the extent to which divisions within the United States domestically, not always expressed by socialists by any means, would undermine America's leadership of globalization. And I think that is happening. That said, let's remember that Amazon, an American corporation, is keeping much of the world economy supply chains going. It's delivering goods and services, right? Not only inside the United States at a level that is unimaginable, right? But is doing so inside most countries in the world, right? And is growing phenomenally because of it. All the more case, of course, for it being made into a public utility. It's not the post office that should be shut down. Amazon should be taken over by the post office and indeed organized. The workers in it unionized. We also see, and this is very significant with regard to Wall Street and China's integration into global capitalism. On April 1st, the Chinese implemented a provision for which they've been under pressure all the way back to Clinton, but especially under Trump, which was to open up their financial services industry to total foreign ownership, especially asset management. And Morgan Stanley on that day bought out, which had a minority stake in a Chinese asset management firm. Soon, on the very day that China introduced that provision, that you could have full foreign ownership of an asset management firm, Morgan Stanley spent $1 billion buying out their Chinese partner so they could have full ownership. And China has generally responded to the pressure by opening up its financial services system to foreign capital, which is what has been Wall Street's agenda since the 1990s. So there is global, you're right, Cliff, I think that the global supply chains have been badly hit. There's no question, and you see it in the amount of goods coming, into Long Beach, the port in Los Angeles. You see it in terms of ships floating around the world's oceans, carrying goods that they can't offload because people don't know what to do with those supplies, even though they've ordered them, et cetera. No, this is a real crisis. And the irrationality, moreover, which was already clear in the context of the ecological crisis, of reliance on global supplies in the production of many essential products, has also been borne out, even in the production of masks, right? Let alone much more vital equipment, right? So ideologically as well, there's a visibility of the irrationality of the system, all of which makes it quite precarious, I agree. Nevertheless, the integration of capitalism, of capitalist firms, of multinational corporations is very real, much more so than it was in the 1920s, when that already negated the isolationism of the Republicans. Well, it's much, much deeper today. So that isolationism has a lot of material forces to contest against, although those material forces are full of contradictions of the kind you were pointing to. And we'll have to see where it goes.
Yeah,
We have more
we're seeing how fragile the globalist project is, depending on global supply chains and just-in-time delivery. It doesn't take much to disrupt that, and of course, the pandemic has disrupted it massively.
Yeah.
For example, came across this statistic that a firm like Volkswagen has 5,000 suppliers, and those are just the first tier suppliers, and each of those have maybe hundreds of suppliers as well. Now,
Yeah,
it
but
doesn't
what-
take
what-
much to break that system.
Yeah,
And-
no, but what does that mean? Does that mean the system collapses? Or does it mean that Volkswagen, and not only Volkswagen, American car companies, let alone tech companies, are extremely powerful capitalist forces, which will, unlike the German steel industrialists backing fascism by 1930-31, not be prepared to support a right-wing isolationism. Sure, they want their tax breaks, and they got it, right? I think the price of all this is that they're going to have to pay a wealth tax, which is going to actually make them swallow very hard, assuming that this turns out the way we'd want to in November. It's an historic election. But it does show you that there are very powerful forces who depend on this system not collapsing, right? From Volkswagen to Amazon.
Get your questions
Zoom.
in. But now,
you-
let me ask Gregory, do you have any questions that you would like to pose?
I do. I have a question. It comes up of a point of irony. Both Sanders and Corbyn, in their campaigns and their political talk, have obviously proposed a lot of reforms, and the powers that be and the pundits have poo-pooed them as being not achievable financially. And the role of the state minimized. However, under this pandemic, with what has happened with the Federal Reserve, as Leo has mentioned, is that probably as much money or more has been put into the system than maybe Corbyn and Sanders have proposed. There's been money to support people. There's been money to support small businesses. England has done that as well. And my question would be is, how much of that is penetrating the consciousness of people in general? And how can that be used as a way of organizing, building reforms, leading ultimately to socialism? Because it was told to us before that it was impossible to do any of these things. And now we're seeing many things that can be done with the necessity to do them.
Yes, absolutely, Gregory. You see, when it comes to reproducing capitalism, as was also seen in wartime, in the Second World War, capitalist states will do things that capitalist politicians said were impossible, or that indeed capitalists didn't let them do, insofar as they had influence over those states. So yes, it's been, astonishing the extent to which not only the Fed's monetary policy, but fiscal expenditure
Mhm.
has been undertaken at a level that goes far beyond what Corbyn or Sanders had the temerity to ask for. Far beyond. Remember the debates when they kept on costing how much it would cost to introduce Medicare? Well, the American Congress has one $3 trillion fiscal stimulus, right? And another $3 trillion fiscal stimulus on the cards, right?
Right.
Everybody during the British election campaign in 2019 kept repeating Margaret Thatcher's mantra, who will pay for it, including working class people in Yorkshire, in the industrial heartlands that were always the base of the Labour Party. And it shows you how far that type of thinking had penetrated. Well, the first thing Boris Johnson said, can't remember whether it was before he got the virus or after, was there is such a thing as society. When Thatcher's famously had said, there is no such thing as society, right? It's a sociologist or socialist construct. There are only individuals and their families and markets, she said. Right? So you see it ideologically and you see it in the policies. And that is one of the reasons that I was saying that I'm not dismayed by Sanders being defeated or Corbyn being defeated. On the contrary, I think in some respects, had they not been, it would be more difficult to build on what has been done in the name of saving capitalism, as well as saving people's lives, of course, in the face of this pandemic. It even goes to the point of, in the Corbyn manifesto was a commitment to nationalize broadband on the internet so that it would be available to regions which did not have it, especially rural areas, but also to poor people which did not have it. And you see today, when schools have to rely on families having broadband in order for their kids to have any access to even public school education, how much sense it makes and how you could make a running on the basic internet services being provided as a public utility, not on the basis of who can pay for it and the expansion of those services so it reaches the whole population. So it ranges across a whole range of things, including in the United States. How difficult it will now be to deny the importance of universal health care. How difficult it will now be to deny that the elderly have been warehoused in the most appalling facilities run for profit across the United States, including in the most wealthy parts of the United States, and the tech giants, those capitalists who are burgeoning today. This has been reinforced ideologically by the establishment media for the most part. Not Fox News, but look at the New York Times. The New York Times series of editorials on what is now required to restore sanity to the American polity is far to the left of the programs of most European social democratic parties. In my own country, in Canada, our national newspaper, the equivalent New York Times, is the Toronto Globe and Mail, a right-wing newspaper for the most part, an establishment right-wing newspaper. Suddenly, out of the blue, it comes out in favor of extending Canada's Medicare system to pharmacare and to dental care, which we've never had. Out of the blue. Socialists need to build on this.
Mhm.
It's not going to necessarily happen, but it does mean when we're making our demands, when we're organizing people, when we're campaigning, we can point to, come on, even the New York Times says this, right? And that's an enormous asset. It's an enormous asset. So it's an irony, you're right, Gregory, but it's something that I think will stand us positively. I'd also say, no, sorry, go ahead.
We have a question from a listener who asks, how should US socialists vote in the United States this year? And of course, getting to would voting for Biden actually and his presidency actually help make gains that socialists want?
Yes, I am very much of the view in a negative sense that a re-election of Trump would mark a historic turn that would close political space for the left for an extremely long time. It's not a matter of, being naive at all, romantic at all about American democracy. It is a matter of, if we're going to be able to continue this socialist current, if we are going to be able to engage in class formation of a kind that will give it a strong class basis, that campaigning for socialism, then we need freedom of speech and freedom of assembly above all. And for that to be denied, which I think could very well be the outcome of a re-election of Trump, would, I think, be a terrible defeat. So it's not a matter of so much being pro-Biden as in the 1930s, being aware of the consequences of fascism for the left. It's a bit like even the Communist Party in the United States rejecting the Stalinist class against class line by the early 30s and coming in behind Roosevelt, recognizing, and this is the whole Popular Front strategy, of course, that the priority had to be to keep space open. And that space did allow for the organizing of the 1930s, which was so important to the New Deal reforms. Couldn't have happened without it. So I think it's a similar parallel we want to make today. And I'd say one other thing, though, that it's also important in this way that I was ending my talk, which is that we do need to rebuild the capacity of states in a democratic fashion. Not the capacity of the military, not the capacity of the police as they're now organized. But one of the great things about the focus on the police and the need to reorganize them and fund them in different ways is that it shows the left is thinking about how to change state apparatuses. Because it isn't just a matter of changing policy. It's a matter of changing the state apparatuses, the agencies, the departments that administer those policies. That's crucial. And that too isn't done at one revolutionary insurrectionary go. It is done through winning the kinds of reforms that are open to other reforms, insofar as socialists shift the balance of forces politically.
We also have a follow-up question to that, which is, how do you turn the Black Lives Matter movement into votes? Obviously, we need for all of this huge outpouring of support for those who are contesting yet again the brutality of the police towards people of color, but of course also towards everyone in society. How do we turn that into votes? Votes against
I
Trump?
think that's the least of our challenges. The campaign managers in the Democratic Party were not only pro-Biden because they thought Sanders and Warren were too radical. They also were pro-Biden because they genuinely believed that he would be able to get out the black vote in a way Hillary Clinton wasn't in 2016, which was indeed the case. I do think that the problem will not lie in the black electorate, least of all on the part of those, except for a handful of anarchists in the black bloc, that black people will be voting in this election. I think you'll also see, in wake of the obvious social inequality in terms of the impact of the pandemic, whereby Latinos as well as blacks are much, much more likely to get it, that the 23% of Latinos who voted for Trump, you won't get anything like that this time. Now, I think the key question, though, is not so much about the vote, although that will come out of this, as whether progressive politics in the United States is going to continue to be framed in terms of equality of opportunity for particularly disadvantaged groups. And there is a tendency in the Black Lives Matter movement to do that, a tendency. When they're asked what their goal is, it sounds like we want as many CEOs in the corporations that are black people or Latinos as there are white people, right? We want as much access to the universities, right? But that hardly solves in any way the crisis of the vast majority of working class people who are Latino and black, let alone those who are white. There's no accountability for a black CEO in the way that a leader of a political movement is accountable to a mobilized movement. Right? And although university professors of color speak in the name of the black masses, there's no political accountability, democratic accountability. There is empathy, right? But that's not the same thing. So what one has to hope out of all of this is that, as I said before, the Achilles heel of the American working class, which is its racial stratification, its unequal racial composition. I mean, unequal in terms of who is defined as being skilled and therefore being paid, et cetera, right? An adequate wage and so on. That will be addressed in the movement, in Black Lives Matter, in the labor movement, in the socialist movement. That's the key, it seems to me, to getting out of this in a socialist way. The vote alone is not going to do that. But I hope, and I think there are tendencies that are pushing in this direction. And I think you're going to see more and more of that taking place. That's part of the importance of socialists leavening the resurgence of black militancy, black political militancy in the current conjuncture. I think this is very, very important.
Betsy, you have any question of your own?
Well, I have quite a few questions. I'm delighted to hear the optimism in what Leo is saying. And because the things do look very grim, and I'm particularly surprised by his description of the role of the Federal Reserve in all of this. I myself have been very critical of the bailout of the banks and the wealthy and the stock market and so forth. But to look at it from the other side, which is, of course, the Fed has managed to keep this whole wobbly mountain of gargantuan mountain of debt from crashing the entire global economy. Well, I guess it's better that than to let the global economy crash. But I think the point about Biden making it possible to rebuild the capacity of the US government or the US state and any other state to make any kind of progressive change is very important, because Trump will repress it. Now, we do have some more questions. The movement for Black Lives is explicitly against what the person calls racial capitalism. How do we get from anti-capitalism to socialism? And then someone else has asked about Bolton. Bolton expressed concern that Trump would not leave office. So there are two questions for you there, please.
Well, before Bolton expressed that concern to me, my friend Frances Fox Piven, who's a great expert on American elections and voting, of course, expressed that to me when I saw her in New York at the beginning of March. She was convinced he would not leave office. And I do think that's why I addressed this in my talk. So Betsy, I'm not entirely optimistic by any means. You know, he has, apart from being the megalomaniac he is, you know, he needs to keep himself out of prison, which he may end up being if he's no longer president.
Yes.
And beyond that, I think that there is a degree of ideological commitment that isn't reflected so much in his zany tweets, but that is seen in the way he does represent a neo-fascist current, which has been around for a long time, from Elmer Gantry on, in American public life. And he therefore will have millions behind him, mobilized by Fox News, since they have very little respect for bourgeois democracy, let alone anything more than that. So I am worried. That's why I think it's very important that hardly the most progressive wing of the American state, the generals, have indicated they would not play a role in allowing this to happen.
Yes, I agree.
I suppose that makes me optimistic in a negative kind of way. And I'd like to say it's similar to what I feel about the Federal Reserve. It's admiration in a negative kind of way, if I may say so, Betsy. You can only save this system by saving the titans of Wall Street. In fact, much of the buying of bonds is being conducted through the asset management companies themselves, through BlackRock.
Yes, I
Since
know.
the Fed wouldn't be able to do it on its own. And the Canadian government and the European government have been contracting BlackRock to do that kind of work for them.
I know.
Right? But that said, it's the same as keeping people in work. You know,
yeah.
Just as you have a furlough system in many countries which keep people in work, despite the fact they are exploited as wage labor. We admire that because it lets them eat, it gives them a roof over their head, etc. In a similar way, were the banks to collapse, on top of the pandemic we are now in, with people not having access to credit cards and other forms of credit, with mortgages being called immediately, with there being a run on the banks, what would be the condition of the masses in this situation? It just shows how dependent we all are on this bloody system with the shysters who run it. I agree with you. But this is the negative way in which one has to admire the Fed, as opposed to those apparatuses of the state that should have been engaging in public health care or nursing home provision of a civilized kind.
We have another question returning to Bolton, and he has expressed concern that Trump would not leave office even if Biden wins. Yeah. And Bolton said he hoped that the legal process would have the tenacity to remove him. But is martial law allowed by the Patriot Act? I personally think it is, but the person is asking the question. Martial law concerns have been raised. However, I've heard that Trump does not have martial law enactment capacity.
No, the Patriot Act doesn't allow, it doesn't allow for the state repression of domestic groups as terrorists. The Patriot Act is constructed in terms of using the repressive apparatus, the security apparatus against foreign terrorists. When there's an apprehended insurrection in the United States, if that's what you would call burning a local police station down, that's another matter. So in any case, it's not in the end, I think, going to be a constitutional question. I don't think the Supreme Court will endorse this at a constitutional level. It'll be much more a matter of whether the military, whether you're going to see, what the United States used to make fun of in what Trump called shitty third world countries, the intervention of the military in the context of elections or the outcome of them. Given the political crisis in those countries, the United States is going through a political crisis, which was a product of the 2008 crisis. And now that has been overlaid by a new economic crisis, which I don't trace back to 2008. I mean, of course, there were underlying conditions, et cetera. This one was caused not by the instability of the financial system. It was caused by production being shut down by a medical pandemic. The productive system was shut. It wasn't that the financial system was shut and then production closed down, right? It was that the production system was going down with implications for finance, of course. And what the Fed at least did was prevent it from turning into a financial crisis as well, right? So what we're seeing is a political crisis that came out of 2008 and the austerity that followed it, right? And now that political crisis is being overlaid by a new economic crisis, one caused by nature biting us back for the way in which we've dominated nature. And that's a different cause, I think. I would say, let's not get too admiring of Bloody Bolton. He's one of the most reactionary figures in American public life over the last 30, 40 years. He closed down the body in the National Security Council that was dealing with pandemics.
Yes.
He drove the health experts out of it. And, what was the public health being located in the National Security Council anyway? That all had to do with linking it up with a fear of chemical warfare. But so one has to be careful with this. Even though it's very nice to see, and I think it's one of the reasons we should be optimistic that the rats are leaving the sinking ship.
We have some more questions. For Trump to refuse to leave office, wouldn't that require significant support from big capital? Another person asked about the prospects for democratic socialism in Canada. And what about the disruption in the supply chains that reduces the capacity of other countries to obtain US dollars, and to obtain US dollars that other banks then use to buy equities and debt of the USA? Is this sending the market up? The US Treasury is one of the handful of countries that can just print money. The Federal Reserve, rather, is one of the few entities that can just print money. So there are a few more questions for you.
Okay. The first question anticipated my last answer, and
Yes.
that is that the most powerful sections of capital had reasons and still have reasons to support Trump in some respects, but in other respects, his reelection would be a disaster for them.
Right.
And you already see this in terms of apparently the breakdown of campaign funding on Wall Street, where the Republicans are having trouble raising at the levels that they did before. We'll have to see, of course, and I don't think socialists want to rely on big capital to save democracy. I'm not saying that. That said, I think that the class alignment, and the New York Times represents this, I think, is such that, for the most part, capital would be, as indeed would most of the deep state in the United States, be happy to see the end of Trump. Not least because, of course, Biden is not a threat in the sense that they would imagine Sanders would be. What we would have to hope is that Biden would leave enough space, open up enough space, reflect a shift in the balance of forces enough that socialists could continue to gather strength. On the second question, Americans, including those of you who live in Mexico, have got to stop being so romantic about Canada. I mean, be romantic about our lakes, be romantic about what nice people we are, but for heaven's sake, don't be romantic about Canada being your Sweden. Canada is not closer to socialism than the United States is. We only look tall because you guys are on your knees. We don't have a phenomenon like our revolution, Sanders, the DSA, Jacobin. We have, plenty of good socialists, and we have the Socialist Project as part of this. Is a remarkable website. I urge everybody to go see it. It has a following right around the world. So much so that when I spoke a couple of years ago in Delhi to the new trade union initiative organizers, who had just organized 20,000 women working for Nokia in Chennai, I wanted to hear from them how they did it, and they said, no, stop. We want first to hear about the revolutionary developments in Toronto. And I almost fell off my chair because they were reading the Socialist Project Bulletin. No, the prospects for socialism in Canada are good. That said, the liberal forces in Canada, the balance of political opinion is far better than in the United States. Definitely. We've had demonstrations here against the police, against police repression of not only Black people, but people with mental illness, demands to defund the police, to restructure them, and so on. Been very impressive ones during the pandemic. So there's movement, But please don't be naive. Don't even be naive about Sweden for that matter, let alone about Canada. As for the dollars thing, in the global south, where the swaps with the central banks have not taken place, there is a real problem of the type that your questioner was pointing to. The G7 states and the G20 states and the American Treasury, as always, since it is the secretary of those bodies, played a positive role in this, did allow for bilateral debt with third world states not to be paid back. And that was already done in, I think, April or early May. But getting private capital that is invested so heavily in the global south, in countries in the global south, developing countries in the global south, to adhere to this is much, much more difficult. As with the Mexican peso crisis in the early 1980s, if you read Volcker's biography, the people he hated most were the Wall Street bankers who wouldn't lift a finger in terms of what the Fed did in order to ensure that the peso crisis didn't bring down Wall Street. They were saving their own asses, and it fell entirely on the Federal Reserve to save their bacon. That happened again in 1994 in that peso crisis. So that's their difficulty, getting private capital to play along in this respect. The IMF doesn't have enough resources to be able to deal with this, and they're under pressure to impose conditionality. The same conditionality that the Swedes insist on when the European Central Bank in Brussels lends to Southern European countries to deal with the pandemic. You know, it's those social democratic countries that are the most fiscally conservative, are most insistent on conditionality of an austerity kind in exchange for loans. So that's where the problem lies. But I think the main avenues of integration are with Europe and China and Japan, Mexico, and there I think they're covered.
Another
Fred,
question we
uh,
have is.
Can you make this the
well,
last? Can you make
Yeah, I
this?
guess so, but I think it's an important question. Will we see any improvement, even with Biden, to address the climate catastrophe?
Yes, I think so. That said, that is, he will sign on to international agreements and maybe more. That said, the first international meeting to deal with the climate crisis was in 1991. If you look at the number of successful free trade agreements that were signed and implemented and made to work since 1991, and compare that to every bloody agreement they signed on to from 1991 on around the climate crisis, with virtually nothing being done, you may get the kind of politics that looks good, but keeps on kicking that can down the road. And we'll have to see. Look, what is needed, and this does pertain to Canada, and I just want to end with this, is clarity on the left, including the environmental left, that we need industrial conversion in one country after another, where firms are shut down, whereby the productive capacities and the skills of those people are not let go to waste, but are transformed through planning apparatuses. It can be at a local level, it can be at a regional level, it can be at a national level, which fund and coordinate the production of alternatives, not only in energy, but in distribution, et cetera, that are not ecologically damaging, that indeed contribute to overcoming the climate crisis. One of the great disappointments of the turn to the left in the British labor movement under Corbyn. And it couldn't have happened without a socialist leading Britain's largest union, Unite, is that union prevented Corbyn's commitment to doing away with Britain's nuclear deterrent, the Trident submarine. It's been a lifelong commitment. He's been head of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. They did not allow that to become Labour Party policy. Why? Because they organized the workers working on the Clydeside, where the submarine was being refitted. Right? And rather than having an imaginative policy for conversion, they said, no, we have to keep the bloody nuclear submarine. So socialists need to be pressing, and it's not impossible that non-socialist governments will implement strategies for conversion, demands for capital controls, demands that when any firms are bailed out, they are taken into the public sector and handed over to the workers or the communities, or both, in which they are located, that banking be turned into a public utility. And if that can't be done in one go, we wouldn't know how to run a banking system, even if it were done at one go, because the state no longer has the expertise. But at least then you need national banks, which are engaged in climate conversion, which are part of a planning system for it, et cetera. And as part of that, we need capital controls. We need to control what's invested, where it's invested, how it's invested, when it's invested. And that has to be done at a national level, and then it has to be coordinated through cooperative capital controls internationally. This is the kind of concrete vision we need, as well as the abstract one of socialism versus barbarism.
Well, Leo, I think we've exhausted our time, and I think we owe you a great debt of gratitude for this rich presentation. I would call attention to our viewers of the fact that that this will be available on our website, so you can listen to it again and again.
It's frozen up.
He's frozen.
And next Monday, we will have Ellen Brown speaking on public banking and public banking as a service. So that will nicely dovetail with your presentation, Leo, and give us some more ideas on what we can demand from a Biden presidency. We've gotten several thank yous from our listeners. So I just want to thank you very much, Leo, for a very thoughtful and measured explanation of the overwhelming complexities of the situation that we're in. And I want to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Betsy. I was very happy to do it.
And we look forward to seeing you here in San Miguel after the pandemic has passed. Assuming
I would like that very much. Not least to see my friend Gregory, who I see is still hanging on there.
Yeah.
Holding his head, I think, at my assault on his sensibilities.
Not at all. I agree with you. What you said. The only difference is I have hope, but not optimism. Anyway, no, I very much liked so much of what you said, and I would have had other questions to ask too, but I'm glad they came from the public at large. So we didn't have to jump in so much. It's much better that way.
Say hi to Liz for me.
Yes,
and to my other
she's
friends
watching. Cliff has disappeared. So I will conclude by asking our listeners to to please tune in next week for Ellen Brown on public banking. And then the week after that, we have Cynthia Kaufman and I forgot his name, Gregory, on policing.
Bill Fletcher.
Bill Fletcher,
Oh,
right,
wonderful.
on policing. And our webinars will continue every Monday for the indefinite future, every Monday at 1 o'clock Central Daylight Time. And they'll be on our web available for people to watch again and to share with their friends. I also want to say that the Center for Global Justice is a small nonprofit organization in San Miguel, Mexico, and all of our revenue producing activities have been brought to an abrupt stop by the pandemic, of course. So if you've enjoyed this presentation, and if you're able, if you could make a donation to the Center for Global Justice, we would appreciate that very much. And I'd like to thank Liz Mestris, Colette Moria, Gregory Diamond for putting together today's program, and of course, Leo Panitch for speaking today. So we will look forward to seeing you all again next Monday, the July 13th, with Ellen Brown on public banking. Thank you very much and stay
So
safe.
long.
Bye.